deaf community is usually not on the short list of groups we think of when we consider the topic of discrimination, but this specific type of discrimination actually has its own name, Audism. There's not been a lot of study on autism compared to other types of discrimination, likely because the deaf community makes up a very small percentage of the population. They are part of the 5.5% of sensory disabled persons, meaning one with a hearing, speech, or vision impairment. I'm not interested in convincing you of whether or not this is an issue, nor do I intend to persuade you to take an action. My only aim for the next 7 minutes is to share the results of 2 research studies and 1 academic journal article with the hope that you will learn something new. Let's start with defining discrimination. Merriam-Webster defines discrimination as, quote, the act, practice, or an instance of discriminating categorically rather than individually, end quote, or, quote, the act of making or perceiving a difference, end quote. www.merriam-webster.com, accessed November 4th, 2019. In America, the word discrimination has become synonymous with malice or hatred. However, present-day discrimination claims are most often unproven, and those that are largely based in fear of the unknown or ignorance. Such is the case for the deaf community. Each one of these 3 academic sources agree that a lack of education regarding the needs of a hearing impaired person is a contributing factor to autism, and this lack of education is on both sides, the employer or community and the hearing impaired person. Of these 3 sources, only one presented a remarkably negative conclusion. It also differs from the other 2 sources in that its focus was on the difficulties hearing impaired persons experience navigating a typical Irish city, whereas the other 2 focus on employment and conclude a low rate of discrimination. Furthermore, occurrences were found not to be malicious, but stem from both employer and employee or applicant not knowing what is needed to make the job adaptable. Let's begin by looking at the results of the 2 research studies. Both studies set out to measure the amount of discrimination sensory disabled persons experience, and both use data from self-identifying sensory disabled persons, with a focus on the hearing impaired. Sources cited in both studies are from 1973 to 2010. There simply has not been a lot of research specifically on autism. This affects the first study the most because advancements in technology have resolved much of the testimonial evidence it presented. For example, one participant in the study complained telephone communication is unfriendly to the deaf because she can't text a taxi after a night of partying at a club. Obviously, this is a non-issue in the present day with multiple taxi-type services operating from mobile devices. Let's continue to learn from Gil Harold's research article, Reconsidering Sound in the City, Asserting the Right to the Deaf-Friendly City in Environment and Planning D, Society and Space, 2013, Volume 31, pages 846 to 862. This is an unusual study because Harold compiles testimony of self-identified, culturally deaf persons as its subject base, and relies on their testimony of the difficulties of navigating typical Irish cities to establish the existence of autism and the physical structure and operations of a city. He notes the deaf move about visually, but cities employ more audible communications. For example, a lifeguard's whistle, a subway announcement, and a cashier's voice at a fast food restaurant cannot be received by a deaf person. Harold posits that part of autism is that the deaf person must live and move in spaces designed for the hearing person. As an argument for the presence of autism in the design and function of cities, he quotes William J. Mitchell's 1995 book, City of Bits, Space, Place, and the Infobomb. Quote, "A space is genuinely public only to the extent that it really is openly accessible and welcoming to members of the community that it serves." End quote. The second study focuses on discrimination versus productivity effects of hearing impaired persons in the workplace. Through strategic implementation of variables affecting employability of persons 21 to 64 years of age, Baldwin and Cho conclude 1/3 of male and less than 1/10 of female deaf persons may be discriminated against by employers by a wage differential compared to non-disabled colleagues. In their 2011 Arizona State University study, estimates of wage discrimination against workers with sensory disabilities with controls for job demands. Such variables as education, work experience, job demands, and sensory capabilities required to perform the job were considered. It was also noted that a large percent of sensory disabled persons are unemployed by choice. If employed, they would lose their Social Security income. This study is significant because there are very few sources focused on discrimination against sensory disabled persons, and even fewer that give full consideration to other variables. Another positive revelation from this study is that advancements in technology have enabled deaf persons to fulfill more job responsibilities. The authors used wage models to explain differences of productivity-related characteristics, sensory limitations, job demands, interaction effects, and sample selection, as well as unexplained mean wage differences in employment functions. The unexplained data is labeled as an estimate of discrimination. The study revealed jobs in which hearing and seeing are classified as important typically pay higher wages. Turning to solutions, Gina Shaw describes equal employment opportunity cases in her article, Fighting Workplace Discrimination Against the Hearing Impaired, in the December 2012 edition of the Hearing Journal. She states, quote, "Workers with hearing impairments and their employers struggle daily to find solutions so that hearing impairment does not interfere with performance," end quote. Gerard Buckley, president of Rochester Institute of Technology's National Technical Institute for the Deaf, and Mary Clark, a professional hearing loss coach, offers solutions such as the hearing impaired person seeks communication strategy training, has their audiologist adjust their hearing aid for their work environment, and uses one of the numerous new communication devices available. And employees use assistive listening or text-based assistance for daily operations and an interpreter for periodic meetings involving a large audience. Shaw concludes both parties can avoid unintentional workplace discrimination by knowing what the hearing impaired person needs to adapt the job. What we have learned about autism is education is the quickest path to understanding one another's needs and responsibilities. We also understand that it is important to know about autism because it teaches us to look for answers before making decisions. Recall how researching available technology for staff meetings or settings on hearing aids could provide viable solutions to successfully employing a hearing impaired person. We can't understand what we do not know. Thank you for your time and attention to learning about autism with me.